Naguib Gunjaria, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Islamic Renaissance Front. Our topic for tonight is the Islamic Jesus, the commonalities between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it is based on the book, The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became the Prophet of the Muslims, a book published in 2017 by Brother Mustafa Akyol, our speaker for today. This talk was initially planned as an intellectual lecture at the Nottingham University, Malaysia in 2017, but it was sadly cancelled by the Malaysian religious authority, JAWI, before they arrested Mustafa Akyol. We'll hear more of this later from Brother Mustafa Akyol himself. So to get to today's topic itself, so Jesus, a central figure in history, claimed by three major world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. To the Jews, Jesus was a revolutionary zealot who was supposed to be the king and the Messiah. He fought against the corrupt practices of the religious establishment and the cruel occupation by the Romans. His messianic mission came short as he was killed on the cross for the crime of sedition against the mighty Roman Empire. To the Christians, the execution of Jesus is not the end. In fact, the crucifixion signifies a new beginning. Jesus died for all human beings as a sacrifice for all our sins, and by believing in his divine status, men are on the right path to attaining salvation, the Christians claim. To the Muslim, Jesus is known as Isa alayhi salam. He was a man born to a virgin mother, Mary or Maryam, the only woman the Quran mentions by name. He was turned into a prophet, a messenger of God, particularly to the children of Israel. He conforms to the teachings of the earlier prophets and holy books, and was awarded with the holy book Injil to guide the children of Israel so that they may obey the rule of God and follow the right path of living. Despite the differences of historical narratives and religious doctrines regarding this important figure, Jesus at best signifies the key values in living life in this world: justice, hope, and love. These values are even more important in current times for the survival of humanity. Reflecting on this important figure, this webinar on the Islamic Jesus, the commonalities between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, shall serve once again as a platform to discuss the topic further in good faith for the benefit of each of us, regardless of our religious differences. Just now about the rundown for our program today. So first, we are going to have the presentation by Brother Mustafa Akyol for about 20 minutes. And this will be followed by a discussion where you're invited to ask questions. Please type your question in the question and answer section at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And finally, we are going to have concluding remarks by Dr. Mohsin Naqvi, who is a fellow at the Islam and Liberty Network and a reputed scholar in biblical studies from North Carolina State University, Chapel Hill. So without further ado, I would like to invite Brother Mustafa Akyol. Brother Mustafa Akyol, the platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Naguib. Thank you, and salam alaikum, and good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to do this event with Islamic Renaissance Front and Islam and Liberty Network as well, two organizations that I really admire and in which I have many friends. Of course, as you kindly reminded, this was planned to be in September 2017, Javi, the religious police institution in Malaysia, wasn't happy with the event. That they were actually more unhappy with another panel, which was the reason of my arrest, which was a panel on apostasy and religious freedom. But so we couldn't do this back in 2017. I'm glad we're doing this today, and I hope authorities will not be too much unhappy with this and create any more problems. I hope so. So here is what I can say. I mean, my book, published actually 5 years ago, the Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Let me say one thing first about the title of the book, because the term the King of the Jews can look puzzling to, not understandably, to some of the people who see the book in the first place, Muslims or others. Where does it come from? Well, that is a reference to the fact that Jesus is seen by both Islam and Christianity as the Messiah. The Quran repeatedly calls Jesus Isa al-Masih. Of course, he's called in the Quran as Isa alayhi salam, peace be upon him, as Isa al-Masih, which means Jesus Christ, literally. And the term King of the Jews is actually a definition of what the Messiah means. The Quran never explains what the term Messiah means, but we know from Jewish literature that the Messiah was a figure that Jews were awaiting, that somebody who would come and bring them redemption and bring them and save them from persecution, especially of the Roman Empire at the time. And the Quran repeatedly says Isa is Messiah, Jesus is Messiah. And when we also know that from the Gospels, that when he was, according to the Gospels, crucified, they put a sign on his head saying the King of the Jews, and that's from which all the you can see that in Latin words in all the depictions of the cross in the Christian literature. So by the King of the Jews, I'm referring to that idea that the Quran says Jesus was the Messiah indeed. But there is something interesting. Of course, Jews don't perceive Messiah as God incarnate. In other words, they don't think that the Messiah will be God the Son, who will be a part of a triune God. Messiah in Judaism is something like Mahdi in Islam, that someone will come and will save and will bring justice and will really change the world for better, but not someone that you will worship as God. Whereas in Christianity, a new meaning was given to the notion of Messiah, and of course that's in Greek language it became Christ. And of course in Christianity, Messiah is not what Jews understand as Messiah, but it is God incarnate, like it's Word of God and God Himself becoming flesh. So it's a doctrine. It's the basis of doctrine of Trinity. So there's an interesting gap. And one thing I find fascinating is that the Quran takes side of Judaism on this discussion of what the Messiah means, because I think Islam, when we compare with the two other great monotheistic traditions in Judaism and Christianity, is very much on the same page with Judaism when it comes to the nature of God. God is one, He's strictly one, and there is no triune nature of God, which is a Christian idea. That's why I use the term the King of the Jews to refer that he was the Messiah. And my book is like, how is it that he's also a prophet of Islam? Well, I begin this story by, I begin the book by actually telling a personal story. It was like two decades ago in early 2000s. I was in Istanbul, my hometown. And I was in Istiklal Caddesi, if you know Istanbul. It's the busiest street most of the time. And I was walking and I was given a copy of the New Testament, Injil, as we would call it in Turkish, by some Christian missionaries who were active in Istanbul. And I appreciated it. I took the New Testament. And as a student of the Quran, I had a great interest in religious literature, but I hadn't really carefully read the Christian texts before, especially the New Testament. And I began reading the New Testament very carefully. It took a few, I think maybe weeks or maybe a few months. Really, I studied it, and there were a lot of passages in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, that are narrations about the acts and sayings of Jesus, a bit like the Hadith literature we have in Islam. It's something that's written after the fact by people who observe the acts of the messenger and then who wrote about it. And there are little differences, of course, because it was written later, and there are different narrations. So, but when I read the Gospels, I was fascinated because I found so many teachings that are ethical, that are deeply resonant with the Quran, that appealed to me. Some of the teachings I found interesting was the criticism by Jesus in the Gospels of some of the rigid literalist clerics, religious figures of his time, who were admonishing other Jews for not being pious, for not observing the law, for being sinful, but they themselves were building an arrogant attitude out of that. And Jesus was criticizing that arrogant attitude. And I said, well, I see similar things in the world of Islam today. So there are maybe certain things that we can learn from these teachings of Jesus. But then, of course, there is another layer in the New Testament, and you see that most clearly in the letters of Paul, who became the disciple that really brought Christianity to the Greco-Roman world. And actually, some people call him as the real founder of Christianity. And then you see the definition of Jesus as divine, and there's a big theological meaning given to his crucifixion. That crucifixion is seen as a redemptive act, which we don't find in the Quran or in the Jewish sources as well. So there's a strictly Paulian theology, which doesn't resonate with Islam, which actually sometimes is in tension with Islam. But then towards the end of the New Testament, there are many letters in the New Testament. There are the Gospels, and then of course there are letters. And there is a letter called the letter of James. It's very short, and I would recommend every Muslim to go and read it, because to me it was fascinating, because it was quite different from the letters of Paul. It didn't include any Christology. It begins with one line which refers to Lord Christ, but what that means is open to interpretation. What is significant is that it doesn't have the aspects of Christian theology that focuses on Jesus's persona or his crucifixion. It focuses on piety and ethics. It's about being steadfast in your observance of God's law and being honest and being very devoted. And when I read the letter of James, I said, well, this sounds quite Islamic to me, and I don't see anything in it that really goes against my beliefs as a Muslim. I even read a passage in the letter of James, which was wow, which gave me that sense of wow. And I want to read it to you. It says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, let's go into the city and spend a year there, trade and make profit. Whereas you don't know what your life will be tomorrow. You should say, if the Lord wills, we will both live and do this or that." Now, when I read this, I said, this is fascinating, because this reminds me a verse, an ayah from the Quran, from Surah Kahf, the 18th chapter of the Quran. And of course, it says, never say about anything, I will do that tomorrow, without adding, if God wills. That's the basis of the word, which, gave us the word inshallah, which is a part of course, Islamic culture. I will do this, inshallah, if God wills. Sometimes people use it without a theological sense, and they means, maybe I will do this, but it doesn't mean that. It means if God wills, you can be still determined to do something. But I said, that's fascinating. So James says, you ought to say, I will do this if God wills. And in the Quran, we have a very similar expression, which triggered me to study the letter of James. And the more I learned about it, I realized that, who was James, first of all? Well, according to Christian literature, according to the Gospels themselves, James was none other than the brother of Jesus. Now, this can look confusing, because we Muslims believe that Jesus was born, and as Christians, Jesus was born without a father, so he doesn't have a family. Like, he has a mother of Mary, but the Quran doesn't mention any brothers of Jesus. But according to the Christian literature, after Jesus was born, Mary had a normal life, and she had a husband, and from that husband she had normal children, not like Jesus, not miraculous, but normal children. And James is mentioned as one of those, and as the biggest, the eldest one. So, and if you read early Christian history that you can read in the book of Acts in the New Testament again, you see that James was the leader of the church that was built in Jerusalem. It's called the Jerusalem church that took the leadership of the movement after Jesus himself. So he was a leader of Christians right after the passing of Jesus. And his letter is quite interesting. It's different than Pauline letters. And that's why actually there has been some Christians in history like Martin Luther, who felt uneasy with this letter, saying that it's not Christian enough to be in the New Testament. But how is that possible? And it's interesting that in Christian imagination, James doesn't have a big role. Certainly it doesn't have the role that Paul has. From that beginning, I get into my book a discussion and a research and a search and a pursuit of these different strains in early Christianity. And when you look into writings of early church fathers, for example, early church fathers in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, they speak of a group called Jewish Christians. They have names like Ebionites or Nazarenes. Why they're called Jewish Christians? Because they are defined as Jews who kept on being Jews, like they observed the Sabbath, they dietary laws of Judaism, but they accepted Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, which put them in a middle position between Judaism and Christianity, because they were not full Christians, because they were not giving up the Jewish law, and they were not fully accepting Christian theology, and church fathers make that obvious. On the other hand, they were not Jews in the traditional sense, because they had accepted a Messiah that other Jews didn't accept. So they are heretics from both sides, from both Jewish and Christian perspectives. And church fathers speak about them and in not good terms, but we don't hear more about them after the 4th century and maybe the 5th century, let's say. And that's very interesting, because the theology of Jewish Christians strongly resemble that of Islam. And in my book, I show that there are even some textual echoes in their sources, in our sources. And I entertained the discussion whether Jewish Christianity represented a precedent for Islam. Of course, that precedent can mean different things. Some European scholars and historians actually were fascinated by this connection, especially in Germany since the 19th century, and they tried to see whether the Jewish Christians survived until early 7th century to the Arabian desert, so whether they could have informed the founding of Islam. Of course, in their idea, Prophet Muhammad could have learned from these people and put that in the Quran. That's not what we Muslims believe. We Muslims believe Prophet Muhammad received revelation from God, so that doesn't have to be a historical connection. But whatever one is a view of faith, the other one is a view of secular history. But from whatever angle you look, it's quite interesting that there is this connection between Jewish Christianity and Islam. Other theologians like Hans Küng wrote about this, and he said this is fascinating, it has to be researched. And my book gives that research and try to make a sense of it. Also, in my book, I show that the narratives of Jesus in the Quran are quite interesting in the sense that they resonate with, they confirm some of the Christian narratives. One is the very birth of Jesus. Of course, Christmas is coming soon, so Christians around the world, in the Western world, will celebrate the birth of Christ. We should know that, of course, we don't agree with the definition of Christ in Christianity, but the birth of Christ is also a sacred event in the Quran as well. In the Surah Maryam, Mary, we're told a story that is very similar to the Gospel of Luke, where, according to which Mary was this pious, chaste woman who was raised by Zechariah, prophet Zechariah, in the temple in Jerusalem. And then that is not, by the way, in the Gospel of Luke. That's in an apocryphal gospel, but that detail. And then angels came to her and they told her about a son, and she asked, how can I have a son? No man has ever touched me. And the angel said, that's what God willed, and whatever God wills, he says, be, and it is. So, which is very similar to the Gospels. And then we heard that, we read in the Quran that Mary gives birth to Jesus miraculously without a father. And his birth, after his birth, Jesus speaks from the cradle to defend his mother from accusations of adultery. So the whole birth of Jesus is a sacred event from an Islamic point of view. Therefore, I think, although we don't agree with fully Christian theology, we can be sympathetic to the idea of a Christmas and certainly not ban it as they do, unfortunately, in some Muslim majority countries. And we can see those commonalities. There are also themes in the Quran, as I mentioned, that are not in the New Testament, but they are in other Gospels. Christians have sources called apocryphal or doubtful, and they were texts that they didn't put into the New Testament. A little bit like our hadith that are weak, that are not in Sahih al-Bukhari, but you can find in other traditions. And there are some ideas in those apocryphal Gospels, or some narratives that resonate with the Quran. For example, in the Quran, you read that Jesus took a piece of clay and he breathes into it, and that becomes a live bird. You will not see this in the New Testament, and that's why most Christians don't know of this. But you can find it in an Eastern Gospel, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. And there is the Protevangelium of James, that's another Eastern Gospel that has some of these narratives. Now, in my book, I go through these things and show the commonalities really between Islam and Christianity. And a few things I say about the tensions between the two faiths as well. One is, the most obvious tension is, that of course, in Christianity, Jesus is seen as God incarnate, like that he's God. He was the Word of God who was God, became living being. And in Islam, that's something we don't accept for anybody, right? God is transcendent, so he doesn't become a body in anybody's person. But I remind that there were Christians who disputed this view, and some of them were Jewish Christians. There were even some non-Jewish, there were some Gentile Christians, and one of them was Servetus, for example, who was persecuted, who was actually executed during the Protestant Reformation because he denied the doctrine of Trinity. It was the time when there was not much free speech or freedom of religion in Europe, and of course, their blasphemers or heretics were being persecuted. And of course, it's a good thing that they moved on from that dark age. So I show these things. And one thing also I emphasize, though, is besides those tensions, also we can try to understand what the Christians are really believing in. And here I think a clear tension is the term word of God that Christians use for Jesus. For us Muslims, we cannot, of course, accept that. We don't want to even hear that. What is that, a word of God? Because the Quran condemns those people who say God has a son. Sorry, not word of God, but son of God. The Quran actually defines Jesus as word of God, and that's very interesting as well. But let's focus on the son of God issue. We all know that the Quran is opposed to the idea that God has a son. He doesn't have a lam yalid wa lam yulad. He doesn't have a child, and he wasn't born. But in Arabic, there are two words for son. One is walad, which is in the verse that I just said in Surah Ikhlas. God doesn't have a child, and he was not the child of somebody. The other one is ibn, and the difference between walad and ibn is walad is always a biological son. So if you have a walad, it means you also had a wife, or you were in sexual act with a female, and that's how you have a walad. But an ibn can be a metaphorical son. You don't have to have a walad to have an ibn. So it can be an adopted son. Now, it's interesting that when the Quran is condemning those who say God has a son, almost with one exception, it is using the word walad. So the people who had a walad, which means who had a biological son. And let's not forget, that is what pagan Arabs believe. Pagan Arabs, polytheist Arabs, the people from Jahiliyyah, time of ignorance, they believe that gods had wives and daughters and sons, and it was like the Greek pantheon. So we can understand that the Quran's condemnation of the people who think God has a son, a child, is partly directed to that. What about the Christian view? Well, Christians, of course, don't think that God had a biological child in the sense that God had a carnal relationship. We should be clear about that. They use the term son of God in a metaphorical sense. Of course, they mean it in a deifying sense we don't accept. But there has been some Islamic scholars in our tradition who said, well, maybe Christians originally meant it in a way that we could understand and even we could accept. In what sense? In the sense that in the Quran, God calls Abraham Khalilullah, which means the friend of God. Does it mean Abraham was divine? No, but it was a title given by God to Abraham to elevate him to a very high status. So Fahrettin al-Razi, the great Sunni exegete of the Quran, says, perhaps the word Ibn, son, occurs in the Gospels to denote high honor, just like the word Khalil means high honor for Abraham. In other words, according to Razi, we don't have to reject the gospel text itself and saying, oh my God, they're calling Jesus son of God, Ibn in this case, but we can understand, oh, maybe there's a different interpretation of this very of this term, and we may disagree on the interpretation, but we don't have to condemn the text itself. With such perspectives, I call on fellow Muslims in the book to get a sense of Christian texts, read the New Testament and learn from it, because I think the experience of Jesus was interesting. As I said, he was a Jew who criticized some of his fellow Jews for being rigid or literalist in their understanding, for being arrogant out of religiosity. And he called for a more ethical, conscientious, merciful understanding of the faith and the religious law. In that case, it was the halakha, which is very similar to Sharia, our religious legal tradition. And I think the Quran itself refers to the Bible and tells Muslims to go and ask from those who read the Bible. And that, based on that, actually, Islamic scholarship learned a lot from Israeliyat in our early centuries. And I think that was not a wrong thing, as some people later thought. We can, I think, read the Gospels, we can read the Bible itself, and we can read more about stories that the Quran just mentions in passing, because the details are there in the Quran. Especially in the New Testament, there will be issues that's not going to work with us. You know, there are some theological perspectives, but then we can make a distinction. We can say, well, we don't understand it this way, but we understand it that way. So I'm calling for a more open attitude towards the New Testament scholarship. Some Muslims have already done this. We have biographies of Jesus written by Muslim authors, especially in Egypt in the 20th century, where a life of Jesus was defined and written, and biography of Jesus was written by Muslim authors who read the New Testament, used the New Testament, and of course used a Quranic filter to interpret certain parts or to disagree with certain parts. But I think that sort of engagement is necessary, because otherwise we're left only with our own texts. And whereas the Quran, I think, is intertextual, it's telling us to learn from previous monotheisms. Because let's not forget that Islam is the continuation of a great monotheistic tradition that goes back to the first person, Adam, of course, the first human, and then Noah and Abraham, and the many prophets the Quran mentioned are actually Jewish prophets, and they are in the Old Testament and the New, and there is Jesus in the New Testament. And I think our religious understanding will be more informed, and we can have better understandings and channels of dialogue between Muslims, Christians, and Jews when we understand these deep connections between our faith traditions. So that's one of the perspectives I espouse in my book, and I'm glad that we're discussing this today, and I'll be happy to hear more from our guests here. And thanks again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brother Mustafa Akyol. Yeah, for those who don't know, Brother Mustafa Akyol is a senior research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He is the author of Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom and Tolerance, the Islamic Jesus, which is the current book we are discussing today, and also Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. The book Islam Without Extremes has been translated in Malay, Islam Tanpa Keekstreman, and it was banned by the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Malaysia, later to be unbanned after a court challenge at the Court of Appeal. Brother Mustafa Akyol has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in Ottoman history from Bogazici University in Istanbul, Turkey. Throughout the past decade, he has given regular lectures at the NATO Defense College and Acton University, in addition to many talks on campuses and public venues in the United States and around the world. In 2017, he was also a senior visiting fellow at the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. So, Brother Mustafa, I'm going to give you the first question. Yes, so you have already broached this earlier. So we have a question from Khairuddin Hussein. Why is Jesus king of the Jews when he was rejected and betrayed by the same people he was sent to? Could you please elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, I mean, it's a big question that Christians and Jews have been discussing for 2,000 years. Right? I mean, there's no easy answer. And well, by betrayed, of course, we should not extend. I mean, there's this whole story of Jesus being crucified by the Romans, and some of the Jewish leaders at the time are kind of helping the Romans do this. Actually, they're going to Romans and asking for Jesus to do this. And based on that, an anti-Semitic view was built by Christians for centuries, which led to some horrible persecution of Jews throughout the Christian history, which was wrong. Because I think whatever happened in first century Judea, it's not about Jews that for thousands of years of people, but it's a certain group of people there. Jesus himself was a Jew and his followers were Jews as well. Now, what is interesting is that this small splinter group within Judaism found echo in what became the Christian world. And I think that is because monotheism is a very powerful idea, and I think it's the truth. I mean, from a religious point of view. And before the coming of Christianity, Roman Empire and the whole what we call West today, Europe today, was all polytheists, and they believed in many gods, like Jahiliya Arabs. And ethical monotheism is a transformative idea, and thanks to Paul and thanks to an incredible twist in history, this actually Jewish teaching, this monotheist Abrahamic teaching, let's say, became growingly popular among Greeks and Romans. And when it became, of course, the official religion of the Roman Empire, it just opened a whole new chapter in world history. So it is interesting that, yes, why Jews rejected it. I mean, there are different Jewish answers to it. Of course, today, Jewish people will tell you that, well, we don't accept that, there's a God incarnate for the exact same reason that we wouldn't accept that. But of course, whether originally Jesus argued that or not, that's open to interpretation. Christians would say yes or no. So I'm not going to say too much about that's what happened. And it's interesting, though, the Quran does criticize Jews for not recognizing Jesus as their Messiah. And again, this was just the Jews at that time. It's not Judaism forever, because after that, Jesus became the symbol and the very epitome of a faith that wasn't in harmony with the strict monotheism of Judaism or that of Islam as well.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa. Yes, so I'll move on to the next question. We have a lot of questions coming. Definitely, this is an exciting topic. Yes, so the next question is from James Jacob Phillips. Did the Jewish Christians view Jesus as divine or as a prophet?
As a prophet. I mean, as a Messiah, which is something like a prophet. They didn't see him as divine, and that's the interesting thing. I mean, we know this again from the writings of church fathers who wrote about these heretics. So they were called heretics precisely because they didn't see Jesus as divine. And again, what does divine mean? And for example, Arians somehow considered Jesus higher than a prophet, certainly, but certainly not God incarnate. And that's why they became heretics in early Christianity as well. But to this question, they did see Jesus as a prophet and a Messiah and not divine. And that's why it's interesting that their view is remarkably similar to the view of Jesus in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition. And that's why historians thought that there must be a connection between these two understandings because they're incredibly similar.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so next question is, you mentioned the Ebionites and implied their beliefs on Jesus were close to the Islamic view of Jesus. How do you explain their denying the virgin birth and affirmation of Jesus' death and resurrection? How does that resonate with Islamic Jesus? The Ebionites would reject the Islamic view of Jesus.
Well, good question. In my book, I discussed that. And the thing is, we don't know whether the Ebionites all rejected the virgin birth because we know about the Ebionites from short commentaries by the Christian church fathers. And my view is that maybe they denied virgin birth, or maybe they denied the meaning given to the virgin birth by Christians, which is, of course, I mean, in Christianity sees virgin birth as the evidence that Jesus is divine, right? I mean, he doesn't have a father, so his father is God. But they may have disputed that without denying the virgin birth. That's one theory I espouse in the book. And the other one is Jesus' death and resurrection. How does it resonate with the Islamic view of Jesus, as Ebionites would reject it? Well, I don't think there is a problem in accepting that the affirmation of Jesus' death and resurrection. Let me see. How do you explain they're denying the virgin birth and affirmation of Jesus' death and resurrection? Well, Muslims can affirm the death and resurrection of Jesus, again, without giving the same theological sense. I mean, the Quran has a verse, of course, which has been used, which has been understood to deny that Jesus was crucified. But as I show in the book, it's not that clear. The Quran is basically saying Jews in Medina, like, no, you couldn't actually kill Jesus. But does it rule out crucifixion itself? It's actually open to interpretation. This is a good question, and I really deal with this in the book. It's a specific thing. The thing is, what exactly the Ebionites believes on these issues is not very clear, but it is clear that they didn't give the same theological meaning given by Pauline Christians on both the virgin birth and the crucifixion story. That's why, for example, you don't see these notions, especially, I mean, the crucifixion and the meaning given to crucifixion by Paul in the letter of James. James never discusses these issues. Of course, I mean, some Christians can say he doesn't discuss because it's already established by Paul and he has a different emphasis. That's one interpretation. But the other one is that if he had this letter that is espousing the beliefs of the early church, he never says anything about the doctrinal significance of the cross and the crucifixion, which is, again, I think interesting. Islam doesn't see a theological meaning in the crucifixion. That's very clear. Islam doesn't see a theological meaning in the death of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or the death of Moses as well. Islam doesn't see a theological significance in the birth of Prophet Muhammad as well, because I mean, Islam sees a significance in revelation, you know, and these are all God's revelation coming to. It's interesting that the birth of Christ is actually honored and narrated in a way similar to the Gospels in the Quran. But again, the Quran says this doesn't mean that he was divine, and telling that story is, I think, partly to make that point. But this is a very good question. I can say the details are really in my book, and I can share more with this friend of ours who posed this question.
Okay, thanks. I'll move on to the next question. Yeah, from Jose Abraham. Will you please throw more light on Jewish Christians and the possibility of their presence in ancient Near East prior to the emergence of Islam? Did they live in Arabia?
Well, the answer is we don't know. And I have a chapter on this book titled The Missing Link. We don't know because the latest we hear about Jewish Christians is, I think, from a 4th century church father, and he mentions those, and after that we don't hear about them. Now, the fact that we don't hear about them doesn't mean they survived or not. You cannot know. There's one thing though, there are some rock inscriptions in Negev in Israel, in the desert, today's Israel, and there are some in those rock inscriptions. There is a passage which is very interesting. It praises the Lord of Moses and Jesus, which is not a Christian way of looking into things, or not a Jewish way of looking into things, because Christians wouldn't say the Lord of Jesus because they consider Jesus as Lord, and they wouldn't put Moses and Jesus on the same page. And the Jews wouldn't do the same thing as well, which sounds like a Jewish Christian expression, which precedes Islam, maybe from the 5th century. So there are like signs like this, and I think Christian and Western scholars have really looked into finding the evidence of Jewish Christianity surviving all the way into 7th century Arabia, or at least 7th century Syria, and of course early 7th century Syria before the birth of Islam, because the Prophet Muhammad traveled to Syria as a merchant, as we know. And the thing is, it's impossible to know. It's impossible to know, but I think it's possible to think that there were a lot of Eastern Christian texts and narratives, especially maybe oral narratives, that were in circulation in early 7th century Arabia, and Muslims might have seen these or heard about these, because also the Quran is in dialogue with these texts. And again, let me reiterate my view that for Muslims, this is all revelation, and God told to Prophet Muhammad, so they didn't have to learn it from anybody. But if you look at it from a secular point of view or a non-Muslim point of view, you can at least trace some of these ideas to possible connections. But there is no evidence showing that Jewish Christians were there in the Hijaz region, especially, or even in Syria in early 7th century Arabia. In the early 7th century. Sorry.
Okay, I'll deal with the question, theological and historical questions first, because before we move on to the more political ones. Okay, so yeah, so one question from Jacqueline Lucose. Jesus being God was not made up by Christians. Why else did he, who we mutually agree was righteous and sinless, accept the worship directed to him? Example, when Thomas, his disciple, called him my Lord and my God.
Well, I mean, with respect, I'm not saying idea is made up by Christians. I believe that Christians sincerely believe in that, and I respect that sincerity there. On this, well, the question would be, of course, how accurate is the New Testament reporting about the teachings of Jesus? So that would be the Muslim response to that. And when you read the Gospels, for example, when you read the Gospel of Mark, there's a passage in which Jesus asks, like, who do people say I am? And the disciples say, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. And in the Gospel of Mark, it's just Messiah. It's just that. When you go to a later gospel, they say you're the Messiah, the Son of God. So they put an explanation to that. Now, was the original text, did it include you're the Son of God part, or was that a later interpretation? When Thomas, his disciple, called him my Lord and my God, was that the original sentence, or was that a later interpretation, later extrapolation? I mean, these are the differences. Otherwise, I'm not certainly claiming Christians made up the idea. It's just how accurate. This is just like us Muslims discussing, well, there's a hadith from Prophet Muhammad where he says this, but is it sahih, or is it mutawatir, or is it how much is it zaif, or is it weak? And even if it is called sahih by Sahih al-Bukhari, maybe is there room for discussion here? And some people say yes, some people say no. So we're not disputing the sincerity of the belief. We would be asking questions about the accuracy of the report, as we would have questions about how accurately Prophet Muhammad was reported in the Hadith literature.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, actually, you did mention in your book that, this discussion, rather than, being stuck in this deadlock, discussing the nature of God, we should move on and instead focus on Jesus' message. Yeah, which means we should reach an ethical consensus and compete with each other in doing good deeds. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is what
I mean, here's
say.
the thing. Absolutely, you're right, Naguib. I mean, one thing is clear, that you can never prove or disprove a theological doctrine in itself. You ultimately choose. I mean, we can never prove or disprove whether the words of a disciple in the New Testament was 100% correct or not. Let's not forget, I mean, the Gospels were written in Greek, in another language, sometime after Christ. I mean, the earliest one is probably Mark, written around the 60s, maybe 30 years after Jesus. By the way, the hadiths were written much later, and I think that should shed light on our understanding of hadith in Islam. Like, I mean, if you're doubting some of the things written down, and if they lived as oral traditions, how accurate these things are, anybody's guess. So it's ultimately an act of faith. And I respect Christian faith, and I understand. I'm a monotheist from a very, Islamic point of view. I understand the Christian understanding. I respect it, and we will not agree there, and that's fine. I think, as you said, one thing is to compete in good things. Second thing, towards the end of my book, I have the chapter, What Jesus Can Teach Us Muslims Today. I say, well, we will always disagree on the nature of Christ, but let's look at the teachings of Christ. And that's why I call on Muslims to look into the New Testament, read the New Testament, learn from the New Testament Gospels. Maybe synoptics are easier than the fourth Gospel from an Islamic point of view, and to learn from the teachings of Jesus about ethics, about morality, about looking into the intentions and morality of the law, rather than being blind literalists, which is very relevant to some of the discussions in Islam today. I see Jesus emphasizing maqasid, the intentions of law, rather than being blind literalists, which is a discussion where we Muslims are having on the matter of Sharia today in the modern world. So that is the part that maybe Muslims and Christians can have a fruitful conversation. On the theological issues, I'm just saying that there were Christians who had different views about Jesus. There were Jewish Christians who didn't believe him as God incarnate, as we Muslims also see. And that connection is interesting. And I think from a Christian point of view, that connection will probably imply that one of the heresies in Christianity ultimately influenced the birth of Islam, whether we Muslims would say, well, this is what we believe as a truth. And it's very interesting that at least there were some Christians who had similar ideas.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question from Zarif. Yeah, you have dealt with this question in your book, so I'll just ask you here. Jesus was given knowledge from the original Torah. Is it true when the teaching of Jesus spread beyond the Israelites then the teaching of Jesus was dramatically altered?
Well, that is the way to understand the development of Pauline Christianity. With Paul, of course, the message of Jesus moved to a Gentile setting, right? And so it just moved away from Judaism and it came into the Greco-Roman world. And that created a tension right there. And you see that in the Acts, I mean, in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. The one early discussion we see there is, can Jews sit with these non-Jews and eat with them? I mean, they're all followers of Jesus now. Are they also bound by Jewish law? Should they have to be circumcised? So these new Greco-Romans, these pagans who believed in Jesus, are they supposed to observe the Jewish law or not? And there's a tension there. You see it right there between Paul and the Jerusalem church. And that's why Paul is called to the Jerusalem church to be questioned on these matters. That's all what the Acts say, but it is possible to think that as Christianity moved away from the Jewish roots, it developed, and or it just went astray. I mean, depending on how you see it, of course. And I think Christians think that the truth was, God meant the truth to be spread to the Greco-Roman world and then become the world religion, and it went through the right way because God guided the community. I respect that point of view. But you can also say that Christianity moved to a non-Semitic environment and a worldview, and the very Semitic understanding of God, which is strong in Judaism and Islam, and also the idea of law, the religious law, which is very strong in Judaism and Islam, was left behind. And again, this is whether this was the right thing or wrong thing, it depends on your faith perspective. But I think historically, we can say that Christianity moved away from its Jewish roots. Historians speak of the departing of the ways between Christianity and Judaism. And I think that departing is also from the Islamic perspective of theology and jurisprudence as well.
Thank you. Yep, we have now a different kind of question, a bit more political. Yes, so from Shaida Hurul Ain, do you think that finding commonalities and sympathetic grounds among the three religions can actually affect politics in Israel-Palestinian conflict?
To some extent. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is less of a religious conflict, but I think more of a national tension, right? I mean, there are Israelis and Palestinians who claim the same land as their homeland. And Palestinians have been driven from their homes, and they lost what they used to be, it used to be their country. So they have a problem there, right? I mean, they demand some justice. And Israelis, Jews were persecuted for 2,000 years when they were minorities. Finally, they found a homeland in their historic place, and they want to preserve that, protect it from destruction. I understand that as well. The question there is, how do we make these two peoples share the land, right? People have been speaking about things like the two-state solution or even one-state solution, where everybody's equal citizenship. I'm not going to get into that discussion, but a part of the problem is, maybe the main problem there is actually national, like the Palestinians as a people, how they will be free, right? I mean, will they have their own land? Will they have their own country? Will they be citizens of an Israel? There are Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. Others are already citizens of Israel, the ones in Israel proper. But there's a religious layer, partly because of the Jerusalem matter. I mean, Jerusalem is the holiest city, and of course, it's under Israeli control fully since 1967. And the tensions around Jerusalem bring a big religious element to it. But I do believe in separating these things. We Muslims and Jews don't have a religious tension. There are theological tensions between Islam and Christianity, but I don't think there's any theological tension between Islam and Judaism. Jews are not trying to convert people into Judaism. And from an Islamic point of view, Judaism is a legitimate religion. Jews can practice their faith, no problem with that. It's interesting that theological and political tensions have been mainly between Islam and Christianity in the past 14 centuries, because both religions are universalistic, both religions are missionary, both religions want to convert people to their faith. We don't have the same issue with Judaism at all. So I believe in separating the theological issue from the political national problem there. I hope a peaceful solution will be found at some point to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I hope Jerusalem will keep on being a city where the three faiths exist freely and, you know, in respect, and people worship in Aqsa, or, you know, the wall, Wailing Wall, or the churches and historic churches in Jerusalem.
Thank you. Yep. A question from Paul Lowe from Malaysia. In order for Muslims to know more about Jesus, Muslims must read the Gospel and New Testament. But in reality, Muslims are often not permitted to read the Bible and have a meaningful dialogue. Should the authorities be more open to allow Muslims to have access to the Bible?
Yes, definitely. I mean, first of all, the authorities should allow Muslims to read anything, right? I mean, including books that are critical of religion or Islam, because I think you become a more mature person if you know different views about the world, and so you can articulate your views better. So even books that are not friendly to religion should be freely read by Muslims, so that Muslims interact with them and that they can learn from secular point of view. But and it's interesting that, you know, in early Islam, I think our great civilization was very productive and successful precisely because it was open to learning from everybody. And early Muslims didn't say Aristotle is kafir, so we should ban his books. Quite the contrary, you know, they studied Aristotle or Plato and other Greek philosophers and scientists, I mean, actually, if you can, or mathematicians, and that created the dynamism of the early Islamic civilization. Regarding the Bible, it's amazing that the Quran refers to the Bible, respects the Bible, but Muslims ban it. I mean, Saudi Arabia bans it. And why? Because we'll be confused. I mean, why it's always us who are being confused, and, you know, not others are not confused when they read the Quran. I mean, I think there's some insecurity there, which reflects an immaturity of our understanding. At a time, especially, I mean, the Quran, the only book in the Quran that is referred to other than the Quran itself and that we can find in the world today is the Bible. So yes, Muslims should be freely reading the Bible. When they read the Bible, especially the New Testament, they will have some questions. Oh, this says this, but what about this? And Muslims should discuss these things, and then Islamic scholars can give answers, and intellectuals can open the discussions, and we can become more mature. Because let's not forget, I mean, the Quran sometimes mentions something in passing and doesn't even tell you much. I mean, that's, for example, the story of Ayub, Job. It's in a few verses of the Quran, but if you go and read the Old Testament, it's a whole chapter, it's a big book. And you learn more about that story, and you get a better sense of it. Unfortunately, by cutting ourselves from all un-Islamic sources of knowledge, let that be the Judeo-Christian religious tradition or the secular philosophies of the world, we just narrowed our understanding of our own Islam itself and I think general worldview. Yeah. So yes, it should be freely read and discussed and studied.
Okay. Yeah, we have a question now from Andrew Koo. Islam's response to Christianity, as reflected in the Quran, appears to have been greatly influenced by a Nestorian understanding of Christianity. If this is correct, has Islam misunderstood Christianity and the nature of who Jesus is?
Well, I would like to hear more about Andrew, about why does he think it's greatly influenced by a Nestorian understanding of Christianity? Does it mean that the Quran is responding to a Nestorian understanding of Christianity? I mean, I haven't studied Nestorianism that much. I mean, I know, I mean, I mentioned passing in the book, but I don't know that understanding of nature. But here's what I can tell you. Islam's response to Christianity or Judaism, or let's say the Quranic response to Christianity and Judaism, is deeply connected with the existing Jewish and Christian sects and theologies in early 7th century Arabia. When the Quran speaks about the Christians and the Jews, it's not speaking about all the Jews and Christians in world history. It's not speaking about the ones who live today. It's speaking about the ones that Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslims encountered. One example of this is, for example, the Quran criticizes Jews for saying Uzair, Ezra probably, is the son of God. Well, ask Jews today, I mean, do you consider Uzair to son of God as son of God? And Jews will say, what are you talking about? I mean, we never heard about that. It's not a tenet of Judaism, but apparently a specific Jewish sect at that time had that belief. So the Quran is responding to that. So I can't say much about Nestorian understanding of Christianity per se, but I can tell you that some of the criticism the Quran poses to Christians is related to Christians of that time and milieu, which had different beliefs. For example, the Quran also criticizes some Christians for deifying Mary. Again, that's not a common Christian belief. But we know that actually there were some Christian sects who almost elevated Mary to a divine figure. So it could be related to that. So I think we need a better history, sense of history to understand the Quran. And we should see what the Quran was responding to. If we don't do that, we absolutize Quranic statements about Jews and Christians, and that's true for their theologies. That's certainly true for their political stance as well. The Quran is in dialogue with what existed at the time of Quran, and I think it's important to understand that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So now I have a question. Yeah, this one is from myself regarding Christian-Muslim interfaith dialogue. Yeah. So one common lament from Muslims is many of these dialogues are actually not done in good faith. Yeah, we find that most Christian-Muslim dialogue actually they're more keen on undermining Islam because they will ask questions. Most of the questions finally go to the historicity of Prophet Muhammad, and also questions which Muslims won't ask. For example, the Last Supper, Muslims don't ask, well, was that table made of cedar wood or pine wood? How about that, the wine from which Jesus drank with his companions? Yeah, what was the percentage of alcohol? Yeah, Muslims, we don't ask that kind of question, but Muslims are always trying to undermine, yes, the moral authority of the Prophet. So do you think that's a fair comment? Mm-hmm.
I agree with you on on the futility of these interfaith polemics, right? One is trying to show that the other side is wrong and their scripture isn't accurate and so on and so forth, and then the other people do it the same way. I mean, I think we should all accept that at some point we are taking an act of faith, right? I mean, as a Muslim, I believe Prophet Muhammad received revelation from God in cave Hira, first, and then in the next 23 years. Well, I cannot prove that through scientific methods and experiments. I mean, right? I mean, it's an act of faith. You trust the Prophet. You trust the Prophet that he was honest, and you also believe in the content of the message. But it's an act of faith, and I can't. Then, in the meantime, I turn to a Christian. I say, well, all you're saying is true. Paul never heard anything, and Jesus didn't say it. Well, I mean, we believe texts written about Prophet Muhammad. I mean, and they believe texts written about Jesus. And of course, we should always use reason to look to make a sense of some of the teachings that we have, and sometimes doubt certain teachings if they go against reason or conscience. But we're taking acts of faith. And when the other person is taking an act of faith, I mean, to make the other side subject to all the rational criticism that you yourself will not do to your faith, that's not a fair way of approaching these things. I think none of us were next to Prophet Muhammad when he was receiving revelations. None of us were next to Jesus himself when he was, uttering certain things and giving his sermons and performing miracles. We ultimately have sacred texts, traditions that tell us about these stories and tell us about these facts, but we believe them. They're facts because we believe in them in the first place. So that's why I think we should understand that there are areas of faith and we take, and that partly comes from our tradition, from upbringing, our intuitions. And we should respect the other side to have its own faith-based perspective as well. Then we can discuss on how we can cooperate, how we can have common values like religious freedom, right? I mean, we cannot accept what religion is true. We cannot agree on which religion is ultimately true, but we can all agree on that there should be religious freedom, that everybody is free to practice their faith. And we can support that religious freedom when we're in a minority or we're in the majority. And I think today, for example, I'll be critical of some of the attitudes against Christians in the Muslim world, in the sense that, I mean, Christians don't have full religious freedom in many parts of the Muslim world. They are subject to oppression. They're in Saudi Arabia, they can even have a church and have a Bible. In other parts of the world, Muslim world, maybe they're active, but they don't have the right to proclaim their faith. Whereas we Muslims have the right to proclaim Islam in Muslim majority countries, in Christian majority countries today, especially in the Western world. So there are issues on which we can agree, that there are issues on which we cannot agree. And we should understand where we don't agree, but it should not be an endless, I'm better than you kind of polemic.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, to add to this, I think the Quran itself recognizes this deadlock. Yeah, so there is a verse on this, like you'll continue to debate until resurrection. Yeah, so we won't be able to figure this out. This will continue. So as you say, I think the best solution is really to focus on doing good deeds, coming together. Yeah, so as members of the Abrahamic faith. Yeah, so this commonality, to build on this, to do good for the world. Yeah.
I mean, the one verse of the Quran, of course, in Surah Ma'idah says, if God had willed, he would have made you one community. But he had willed, that you had different shara, the different religious traditions. So the whole world will not be Muslim. The whole world will not be Christian. That doesn't have to be the case. And according to the Quran, that's not even God had willed. So it's only normal that we have different religious traditions, and we should follow our traditions, be respectful to others, and try to build a world in which everybody can follow their persuasions without oppression and without discrimination.
Thank you. Yeah. So, well, please keep sending us questions on the question and answer section. Yeah. So, one question from Jacqueline Lucosi. Yeah. So, and if Jesus is divine and not man, could it be that he is not the same person written about in the Quran?
I mean, if Jesus is divine and not man, by the way, Christians would say he's fully divine and who's fully human, right? Even so, I understand the point of view. I mean, if the Christian mainstream Christian definition of Jesus as divine is true, then of course the Quran doesn't go with that, or I mean, that would be against the Quran. I mean, the Quran has its own point of view. Again, if you're a Christian, you will not accept it. And according to that point of view, Jesus is highly revered. He's called the Word of God, which is very interesting. Nobody's called Word of God in the Quran. He's highly praised. His mother is praised, but the Quran emphasizes that he's a servant of God and he should not be worshipped. So obviously there's a tension here. The only thing I will tell you is that, I mean, Christians themselves didn't agree on this issue. I mean, why a man like Servetus was executed in Geneva at the time of Calvin, on the orders of Calvin, because he didn't accept the doctrine of Trinity. There has been non-Trinitarian Christians from the first century to today. They're called Unitarians. Some Unitarians escaped Europe and came to the Ottoman Empire because they were persecuted at the time. That was like, again, 4 centuries ago. So even among Christians, there has been different views of Christ. Just like among Muslims, there are different views on the nature of the Quran. I mean, is Quran created by God or was it co-eternal with God? So Muslims discussed this issue in the first centuries of Islam, and the mainstream Sunni view emphasized the uncreated Quran doctrine, but that's not the only doctrine within Islam. So these disputes will be there. And of course, if one is true, the other one is false, but you accept this one is true because that's your faith, and I respect that. But then the other person will have their own faith. I still believe in trying to reconcile these traditions as much as what we do. For example, that's why, I mean, I emphasize that the Quranic rejection of the idea of a son of God is very much related with a pagan polytheistic context, where gods had their children and families and wives and sexual relations. So we would be wrong to think that that is what Christians believe. That's not what Christianity believes. We should be fair about that. Also, I think that some of the Christian beliefs have been caricaturized in the Muslim world, and I'm trying to bring some nuance on these issues, especially on the Son of God issue. So yeah, that's what I can say on to that question. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, well, we have one question from Khairuddin Hussein. Well, it's about the historicity question again. Yeah, there have been authors and researchers who put emphasis on finding archaeological proof of Jesus, Muhammad, and even the flood during Noah's ministry. What is your view on this?
Well, it would be, of course, interesting and world-changing to find any such proof, but I don't think there's too much. On Jesus, what I know is that there is a proof that someone named Pontius Pilate, existed in the Roman Empire. It was found in a Roman engraving. Of course, Pilate was the man who was the ruler of Judea, the Roman ruler of Judea at the time of Christ. And according to the Gospels, Jesus was brought to him for crucifixion. So you don't have any text saying that there man named like Jesus who lived here, but you have Pontius Pilate being mentioned in the religious text. And of course, people find, I mean, there's a lot of faith involved. So when people find something, they want to connect it, but it's hard. I mean, same with Prophet Muhammad. I mean, we know Islam from Islamic sources. I mean, we know the life of Prophet Muhammad because Muslims wrote about this. Did non-Muslims write about Prophet Muhammad? Well, you have some Christian texts speaking about the Arabs and they have a prophet and, they're conquering places. So you have sort of texts by Christian and Jewish authors. And I think probably the history of Islam is more documented than the histories of early Christianity and Judaism, because it's more recent, and Muslims had also states and they preserved the texts, and it's more in front of history, which doesn't mean that it is theologically proven. That's a different thing. Regarding the flood, I haven't seen anything that really confirms the flood, and some of these also stories might not be as literal as we think they are. It could be more maybe local things. I don't think there was a global flood. Honestly, it could be a local event. So I doubt. I mean, there's a lot of interest, but that interest might drive archaeological research, which is good. And archaeological research can bring us more information about the world, which is good in itself. But I don't think that we will find something and say, this is the proof of the truth of that religion. I don't think that it works that way. But there are people who dispute. One more thing, there are historians who even dispute, maybe there was no Jesus, it was a made-up story. A few people even suggested about Prophet Muhammad. That I find bizarre. I mean, because obviously these people existed and they initiated a movement and transformed lives and inspired so many people. Why otherwise, such movements come in the first place? I mean, just from a rational point of view, I think it makes sense to believe they existed as we basically understand them today.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa. Yeah, well, we are coming to almost the end of this session. Yeah, and yeah, so well, one thing here is Jesus and his mother Mary are revered figures in the Quran, and it's amazing that in the Quran, there is a verse, "Oh Mary, God has chosen you above all women in the world," and it's not even the Prophet's wife, Khadija, or his mother Amina. Yeah, here the Quran is, giving that kind of status to Mary. Yeah,
that's amazing.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, the Quran doesn't speak much about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because the Quran speaks to him, right? The Quran educates Prophet Muhammad about previous prophets. That's why the person who's most mentioned and narrated in the Quran is Moses, who's a role model for Prophet Muhammad, right? Prophet Muhammad follows the footsteps of Moses. And after Moses, there's Abraham and Christ and Mary. So the Quran is educating Muslims about these previous sacred figures, prophets, or Mary is not called a prophet, but she's the highest. I mean, she's the most honorable woman in world history. That's amazing. And that's why, I mean, we should also not shy away from learning about the life of Mary from pre-Islamic sources as well. I mean, we can consider them as historical sources. I mean, we don't have to have even the faith in the historical accuracy of those things. But if the Quran mentions Moses and there is a encyclopedia entry written about Moses, some 10 centuries ago, we would read that. We would be curious. Why don't we read the Old Testament, right? And same thing for the New Testament. I believe a Muslim reading an interpretation of the New Testament is possible, and it will be enlightening, while we will have the theological gaps between the two traditions, and they're fine.
Thank you very much, Brother Mustafa. So, well, we have more questions, but I think for this session, we've had enough questions. So please forgive us if we are not able to answer these questions. I believe some of the questions you have already dealt with them. Yeah, so not in detail, but
yeah, I mean, I couldn't get into every single detail.
Yes.
I mean, there were questions about Ebionites or Nestorians, I mean, other things. I get to those things sometimes in footnotes in my book. So I would encourage to check my book on this issue. But I'm glad we had this discussion. Thank you so much. We got so many interesting questions and comments from Muslims, Christians who are joining us in different parts of the world. And people can email me later if they want to ask something more specific. I'll be happy to help. And finally, I'm glad we had this event, and hope Jabi officers, if they watch this, they can see that there's nothing shocking, and there's no big fitna or anything like that. And as Muslims and Christians, we just had a thoughtful, informative conversation, and we more of these things. And what we don't need is banning these conversations, which unfortunately prevents Muslim societies from developing more intellectually robust views and arguments.
Thank you very much, Brother Mustafa, for this open and frank discussion. So now to conclude this webinar, I would like to invite Dr. Mohsin Naqvi, an independent academic and scholar of Islamic studies based in Pakistan and a senior fellow at the Islam and Liberty Network. Dr. Mohsin Naqvi holds a doctorate in biblical studies from the North Carolina State University, Chapel Hill, where his main research was on synoptic gospel. Prior to this, he completed formal religious education from local seminaries in Pakistan and got his higher education in Iraq. Dr. Naqvi is proficient in many languages, including Arabic, Persian, English, and Urdu. He is the author of 12 books, and he has served on board of Council of Islamic Ideology and advisory body to the government of Pakistan. So let's welcome Dr. Mohsin Naqvi.
Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum, all the fellows, for giving me time, giving me chance to have a concluding remarks. Brother Mustafa Akyol, I have read many of his articles and two previous books. Unfortunately, not this one, which is about Jesus the Christ. Can you people hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
I can hear you,
we can hear
and
you.
thank you so much. And I'm honored to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. As far as his presentation is concerned, his conversation is concerned, whatever he has said, that was very inspiring and very good. It was well researched, I think. And as far as I know, there are a few Muslim scholars who can very with authenticity can talk about this issue. One of them is Brother Mustafa Akyol. Actually, he's right to say that he can't cover all the aspects which the single issue basically covers, or it is spread to different dimensions. But one thing is very clear from his words also, that we can't bring faiths, different faiths together, whether they are Abrahamic faiths or non-Abrahamic faiths. We can bring together the followers of these faiths. And the best thing is to study each other, their texts, their books, the interpretation of their text, and a very close interaction with the people, because sometimes we churn in our mind, develop in our mind different ideas which are about different religions, which are even alien to those religions as a fact. Knowing some excerpts from, or reading some excerpt from different religious books or scriptures is something else. And reading properly the theology of any religion or any sect of Islam and interdisciplines is something very different. What I got from Brother Mustafa Akyol's speech is that we should go through the scriptures and the text and development of the ideas which took place throughout the history. Christianity is not a single version. Likewise, Islam is not a single version. We divide usually Christianity and Christian theology, pre-Pauline period, post-Pauline period, and then Christianity interpreted by different councils which were held under popes or under the fathers. So there have been development of different theological issues, practical issues, different ideas. And if you study the Vatican Council II and its interpretation, which is considered as the latest, they appreciate Muslims' point of view about Christianity, about beliefs, about Mary, about Jesus, and all that. Because now the perspective of each nation, each faith has changed. I would like to share this with other participants, that when any faith or any ideology or any philosophy is dominant in a certain area, its mentality is different from when it becomes subject, comes to being a subject phase. So Islam developed in different phases. When Muslims were dominating the world, their interpretation, uh, particularly regarding relationship with the followers of other faiths, was different. Now we are we are living in different circumstances all over the world with non-Muslims in education, in schools, in colleges, in professional institutions, and all that. So the interpretation of Islam is changing. In West, it is different. In America, it is because the circumstances are different. Here in Pakistan or this part of the world, it is people are looking towards Islam in a different from different angle. Likewise, Christianity and Judaism pass through different phases. As far as our brother Mustafa Akyol concentrated on concept of Jesus as a Christ and his crucifixion and the role of Mary in Christian theology and all that. These are all very much relevant issues on which Muslims should concentrate. Muslims should try to understand different phases of the interpretation. And here we can't say like in Islam, people interpret some a verse of Quran in which God says no one can touch Quran except the pure one, which a pure one. La yamassu illa al-mutahharun. But all over the world, Quran is available on the shelves, and Muslims and non-Muslims both buy the copies of the Quran, and they try to read it, understand it, if they are interested. Likewise, Bible is open for all. We Muslims should not remain ignored. We should not ignore these texts, Bible or Talmud or Mishnah, Midrash. And one thing more, I think Brother Akyol may have described in his book that canonization of Old Testament and New Testament have been a problem. Sometimes the scholars introduced some books which are now included in apocrypha, pseudo-apocrypha, and sometimes they put inside the main corpus of the sacred books. So when we talk about Muslim ideas about the prophets of Jew prophets or prophets of the Old Testament or Hebrew Testament or Greek Testament, we should keep in mind the whole literature before. It is an advice for Muslims before coming to or jumping into conclusions that they believe this, it is like that, it is like that. No. As we have a school, Brother Akyol, Mustafa Akyol has pointed out, as we have internal disputes in our scholasticism and philosophy, they also have such disputes. And there is a history of Muslim philosophy based on Church Fathers philosophy, based on Neoplatonism, based on Greek philosophy and all that. And these things influenced not only Muslim scholasticism and Muslim philosophy, but Judaism and Christianity and interpretation of their faith also. So it is not a single faith, as Brother Akyol has pointed out, different phases. And I am trying to make my audience clear. So his presentation was very, very informative, very good, very, after a long time, I have heard such a learned person talking on this issue. Thank you very much, Brother Mustafa Akyol, for enlightening us on these issues. Thank you.
Astaghfirullah. Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Professor.
Dr. Naqvi, for this very kind and generous comment of yours. I'm humbled to hear these from you, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and thanks to our friends for bringing us today, Dr. Ahmed Farooq Musa, our friend Ali Salman from Islamic Renaissance Front, Naguib, and all our friends who joined us. I mean, it was a great event with a lot of great questions and comments. It's my pleasure. It's my honor. Thank you very much. Inshallah, I'll come to Malaysia in person too at some point, and without any trouble, and we can discuss these in person then as well. But are you in Pakistan, Dr. Naqvi?
Yes, I am in Pakistan, and I
Okay.
wish to be in Malaysia for attending your lecture.
Okay, great. Well,
Or
Jiba
delivering
Pakistan.
my own lecture over there.
Okay, great. Salam alaikum to Pakistan.
Salam.
Salam alaikum to Malaysia and
Salam.
everywhere. People
Salam.
Yeah.
who's
Thank
watching
you
us.
very much. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much, all the speakers, the organizers, and our participants as well, who have contributed to a very fruitful discussion today. And this is our last session for this year. So we'll see you next year, inshallah. With that,
Inshallah.
I would like to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.